I'm often intrigued, all of the sports medicine scientists in the world, and very, very few have shown any interest in breathing in and out through the nose. You are one of a handful. I cannot think of any more than maybe five. And I
Yeah.
don't even think there is five sports medicine scientists who have investigated nose breathing during physical movement.
So I
Why do
think
you
there's
think
some
that's
reasons.
so?
I think there are some reasons for that. The first thing is our field was premised on the idea that you would breathe from your mouth, going back into about the 40s, 1940s, when this field started to really emerge with stress testing and the ability to use a system to analyze expired gas so you could calculate metabolically how much energy you're using, oxygen consumed, CO2 expelled, all that sort of thing. From the get-go, we use systems where we clip the nose and you breathe through the mouth because people just presume that that's what you had to do. And there's a reason for that. It's a very natural thing that if you begin to exert yourself beyond a level that you're accustomed to, you achieve a little higher production of CO2. That's an outcome of increased metabolism. And your body, essentially, and your brain, nervous system essentially tells you to deal with that most successfully. And the easiest way to reduce that is simply to increase your ventilation. So, of course, we can increase our ventilation quite a bit when we breathe through our mouths. So we develop this response kind of naturally. And then the third thing that's really significant is that, if we try to breathe through our nose, human beings really struggle with the idea, I'm going to have to adapt to this or slow down. They just want to go out and try to do it in the way that they normally engage in their physical activity. So if I'm a runner who normally runs at 8-minute miles, I try to go out and run at 8-minute miles breathing through my nose. And of course, right away, you're still at that stage not developed to breathe that way. So you're hypoventilating, meaning that you're ventilating less than is necessary to oxygenate your tissues adequately. So what you feel is this extreme air hunger, not from that lack of oxygenation, but because of the increase in CO2 that you experience. And that's like this horror, I'm threatening your life kind of message that stops you right in your tracks. Even if you maybe consciously have thought about the idea that maybe there's something more than this, that's a hard thing to want to reproduce, right? So we never even considered the concept that, well, maybe that goes away, or maybe that's because of the condition of already having developed the ability to work breathing through your mouth. Maybe we could change that. That never really came in anybody's thought process. So a kind of another big idea, and this actually ties back to where I went to grad school. I actually went to the University of Arizona to extend my water polo career, but also because there was a scientist there by the name of Jack Wilmore, who was very well known in exercise science at the time. And at some point, I think after I was an undergrad, got involved with a scientist, I think his name is Alan Morton over in Australia, who was very interested in asthma. And I think probably they formulated the idea of testing the ability to breathe through your nose because late in the 70s and early in the 80s, there were some other, I wouldn't call them exercise physiologists, I'd probably call them physicians, who had examined the idea of doing that with people who had asthma, traditional asthma, and found that it actually inhibited their asthmatic response during exercise. So then they looked to see, well, what work capacity can you actually produce breathing through your nose? So they did what I still consider the hallmark or the seminal study on the topic, where they took undergrad students and basically had them do max test breathing through their nose, breathing orally, restricted to the mouth, and breathing oronasally. And they showed that when you breathe through your nose, you impacted your work capacity or the peak velocity you could achieve by about 10%. You impacted your VO2 by about 10% at maximum, and your ventilation literally was reduced by about 30%. So even though their study highlights the idea that breathing was more efficient, it basically says to people who read it, don't do this because you're going to impact your work capacity. And in the mind of athletes and of scientists who study exercise, something that's going to inhibit your work capacity is a non-player at that point. You're not that interested at that point. So again, nobody ever thought about the idea that, well, maybe you could move past that because maybe this way of breathing, which you don't normally do, is different enough that you might adapt to it individually or separately from the way that you adapt to all breathing. But that didn't enter the consciousness, right? If you were studying science and you found that study, you were basically like, this is a non-viable solution.
Yeah,
So it
so
was only, go ahead.
So basically in 1995, that was Morton's study. So he was
Yes.
showing that VO2 max was reduced by in around 10% when individuals switched from mouth to nose breathing, given that these guys or girls had never trained, so their body hadn't adapted to it. Now,
Well,
that's still,
never trained breathing nasally. They had
sorry,
these were,
nasally, yes,
not necessarily untrained, but never trained
correct.
breathing nasally.
Yes. Um, your paper as well in 2018, the VO2 was also reduced. I can't remember the exact figure. And it's still today a question that comes in that there's so much emphasis on VO2. Would you mind just teasing that out a little bit in terms of is it something to be of concern based on that the people in your study, they reduced their ventilation by 22% after they had adapted to breathing through their nose exclusively for 6 months during physical exercise.
Yes.
Will you tease that out a little for us?
Sure, that gets a little bit complicated and it gets into this idea that we refer to in exercise physiology as economy, right? So the fact that the subjects in our study in a steady state trial where they're running at a constant speed, it was about 85% of the speed that they achieved in their first VO2 max test, what we call the familiarization test, right? And so that was constant. We then had them run, I believe it was 10 minutes total and 6 minutes of data that we collected from that. We then had them run at that speed for about 10 minutes. Maybe I think it was 10 minutes after we finished their max test. And so what we were looking for there was this economy idea, was the idea that maybe you can achieve the work using less oxygen. So most people understand this too simplistically, right? They think the higher your VO2 max, the better. But really what's important is the work at which you achieve that VO2 max. In fact, historically, if we see two really high-level athletes achieving a very similar high level of work, but one has a lower VO2, we actually consider that that athlete is more capable because they're essentially able to operate at that high work level more efficiently, right? So that part never gets to the general public. They understand the idea that, well, higher VO2 max is better. Lots of coaches understand that, like it's the end all of your ability to perform. It really isn't. It's just a way to measure how efficiently you're performing. The end all of how you perform is the work you can do, how fast you can run, if we're talking about running, for instance. So that's the first piece, right? The second piece is that when you're breathing nasally and you've adapted to doing this, it's not that you're 22% less because you can't necessarily produce that ventilation. You're actually increasing what you could produce before you adapted to nasal breathing. So we absolutely understand, we're actually doing a study now to look at the full adaptive process. We absolutely understand that you can improve how much ventilation you can achieve nasally. So the main mechanism for that is probably the idea of, using your diaphragm differently. I think you've talked about this in your materials quite a bit. Because nasal breathing requires this higher resistance to be overcome, drawing the air through all the filtering apparatus, we engage our diaphragm differently. We have more use of the diaphragm and less use of the ancillary or intercostal muscles, things like that. We breathe more from the complete lung, the complete thorax, and less from the chest. So that actually is a thing you have to adapt to. An analogy that I think about would be like a cyclist, right? We increase a cyclist's ability to go faster, not only by pedaling faster, but also by increasing the size of the gear that they can pedal. So when you initially try to pedal a bigger gear for a given power output, at first you fatigue, but then your body, your muscles, skeletal muscles, they start to adapt to that. So when you start breathing more at a higher force level, but a little slower, it's sort of like using a bigger gear on a bike. Your diaphragm has to adapt to that, but of course it does. It's a skeletal muscle. It's very adaptable. So partly how we increase our output breathing nasally is by adapting our diaphragm. There's probably also some stuff that's happening in the small muscles that allow you to flare your nose and open your nasal passage. There's probably some things that are happening internally that also allow better nasal airflow. But the big thing is you got to get your diaphragm to be accustomed to that kind of work. So then that gap between what you can produce orally and what you can produce nasally, it reduces. So you don't ever have to achieve what you can produce orally because nasal breathing is so much more efficient. So what do we mean by that? Well, when we take a breath breathing nasally, we can extract more oxygen out of it than we take a breath breathing orally, which of course we demonstrated in our study. And that's for a variety of reasons that get complicated. Probably part of the reason is because of the effect of nitric oxide. Probably not only allows you to maintain better dilation of your bronchi, probably also helps you in dilation of the blood vessels that are passing by the lung. So you get a better diffusion gradient, more blood flow passing by the lung. It also probably has to do with the fact that when we use that bigger force to draw into our air, an analogy I use in my book is it's sort of like opening a door that's stuck, right? When you finally get it to open, it transfers, all that momentum transfers and you go backwards. So if you think of the air being pulled in with this greater force, that air probably, no one's ever studied this directly, but that air probably distributes throughout the lung more, meaning that more of the alveoli are actually exposed to new air, which then improves diffusion, right? We definitely know that when we get more air exchange in the lung, diffusion improves because more alveoli potentially can exchange an oxygen molecule and a CO2 molecule. So all those things contribute to the idea we don't actually have to breathe as much. So we can sort of stop thinking about it as okay, now we're limited once we've adapted. Now we're limited by how much ventilation we can produce. The way I think about it is we only have to produce that amount of ventilation because our diffusion of oxygen is so much more efficient. We can draw more out of each breath. And that's without taking a bigger breath, right? That's in our study, we were able to illustrate that, during the nasal breathing conditions, these athletes or subjects were actually taking the same tidal volume, the same size of each breath, but they were getting this improved diffusion, extracting a little more oxygen. So then how much? Well, normally oxygen comes in at 20.93% or about 21% from the air around us. And during heavy exercise, it might be leaving at about 17 to maybe as low as 14%. So all we're talking about is like 1% more maybe, right? So maybe 17 becomes 16. So it's not actually a very big change, and we're still not remotely exploiting all the oxygen we have in each breath. We're taking still literally around a quarter of that oxygen out.
So can I just explain there? Sorry, George. So basically, so at sea level, atmospheric pressure is whatever, 760 millimeters of mercury. Of that, 21% is oxygen. So the athlete is bringing in 21%. The oxygen then, of course, is passing into the blood. It's doing a round trip around the body. And then normally, even during intense exercise, if I can interpret correctly from you, the athlete is breathing out 17%.
That's exactly right. And in fact, they're only taking out that difference, right? The difference between 21 and 17. Most of that oxygen just comes in and goes out again, right? It doesn't all leave and then return somehow.
And can I clarify, even if that's during maximum physical exercise, this isn't just about going for a jog. This is maximum intensity exercise.
I would say at maximum, you might get as low as 15%. During typical exercise, it might be more like 17%. That varies person to person a little bit. So the idea, though, is that nasal breathing, you only have to add maybe a 1% more, right? So maybe 17 becomes 16. You don't have to take much more oxygen. And if you think about that, the difference between, say, 21 and 17, is 4. That's roughly a fifth of the total amount of oxygen you have in the first place. So that fifth, right, or about 20% maybe becomes like 21 or 22%. You don't have to actually extract a whole lot more oxygen just to allow yourself to breathe nasally, because again, it just works so much more efficiently. Yeah. So we think of this as some huge change that we have to make. It's really not, right? In fact, lots of people who are already well-trained can breathe nasally up to around their aerobic threshold without any specific adaptation at all. They just have to choose to breathe that way. As we push further and further, it literally or starts to really require some adaptation. But even at maximum, the values I'm talking about probably reflect maximum, right? Even there, the amount of increased oxygen we have to get out of each breath is a very small amount, right? It's maybe 1 or 2% of the total oxygen that we have in that breath of air that's entered our lung in the first place. So that's not a very big change. And it makes sense that we can do that because, again, we've evolved to breathe through our nose. That's very clear, right? Clearly, our mouth is an emergency mechanism. So here's what that means. Since we don't have to breathe nearly as frequently, like I think the difference between nasal and oral condition in our subjects was something like
10 breaths. 49 to 39 breaths.
49 to 39. So literally like 25% difference in respiratory rate. So because we don't have to take as many breaths, right? And we're extracting this little bit more oxygen out of each breath. It ends up that the total ventilation is actually substantially still lower. So that 22% lower ventilation, well, you're thinking, well, big deal, right? But it is a huge deal because ventilation requires skeletal
Effort.
muscle work, right? There's a significant amount of work being done by the respiratory muscles just to create that ventilation. So that ends up being somewhere around 10 to 15% near maximum. So if you take out like essentially about a quarter of that, right, that's a significant reduction in the work that you have to do totally, right? Your
Can
total
I
metabolic
just
work
come
to
back
improve
there? So
something like running.
just to explain that, George, sorry, I need to keep it as simple because I
Oh,
know you're
good.
very scientific.
No worries.
Um, so just for the lay person listening in, every time we take a breath, the respiratory system needs oxygen.
Yes.
And what you're saying is during intense physical exercise, the oxygen that's going to support the respiratory system is about 10 to 15%. Now, you're also saying that once your athletes adapted to nose breathing, they just didn't have to work their breathing muscles so hard. So as a result, they weren't using so much oxygen up just to support their breathing muscles, which in turn then would leave more oxygen then for, say, the working muscles.
That's a very good summary, right?
Okay.
So in leaving that more oxygen for the working muscles, we can work a little harder because we don't have to devote so much oxygen. You could also think of it as blood, right? Blood flow. We can work a little harder. So maybe 2 or 3% harder. So there's something analogous that we discovered in, I believe, the 1980s, where if you strength train a runner and they become stronger, they can reduce their total energy cost by about 2 or 3%, and they can run that little bit faster. And so we devote a whole thing to that now in training athletes where, a significant chunk of time goes to strength training them so that they can run more economically. So we're talking about a similar amount of benefit by changing how you breathe and not doing anything else beyond that, simply adapting to breathing in this new way. So this is now why I think when after the year I spent, or 6 months to a year I spent really adapting to this, right, why I could run faster, even though I was already like 48 at the time. This is a long time ago, by the way. And I'd been doing the sport of triathlon already for 20, 25 years, something like that. You don't improve at that point. You're trying to slow down, getting slower. But yet I actually went in the other direction for a while and started to improve. So, that really got me to bite hard on this idea because I'm a performance guy. I was very interested and did it originally to allow myself to not get sick so much. But, I started realizing this is also potentially going to help our performance.